Hey guys, today we're talking about how God built silence. Dim your lights, get comfortable, and enjoy. Don't forget to like and subscribe if this helps you fall asleep. Also, make sure to let us know in the comments where you're from and what time you're watching this. Let's start. In the beginning, there was sound. It wasn't noise as we know it, not clamour or confusion, but the pure hum of existence. Everything that lived, moved, or even thought vibrated in this unending song. The wind sang through the stars sang back to the sea, and the sea repeated every melody it had ever heard. The universe was a choir that never paused for breath. But one day, though day didn't exist yet, God listened closely and realized something was missing. The songs were beautiful, yes, but beauty that never rests becomes heavy. There was rhythm, there was harmony, but there was no space between the notes. Every sound chased another, afraid of being forgotten. And so, God wondered what it might feel like if everything stopped for a moment, if sound had somewhere to sit down. He didn't want to destroy the music. He wanted to give it a place to breathe. So he walked through the endless singing of creation, each vibration brushing against his hands like strands of light. He gathered them one by one, humming softly as he did, until he stood in the center of everything and whispered a single word that no one had ever heard before. Hush. The word was gentle, not a command, not power, but permission. And all at once, the sound folded inward. The winds slowed, the seas stilled. Even the stars blinked in surprise. The great choir of the universe didn't vanish. It simply held its breath. That was how silence was born, not as absence, but as pause. It was fragile at first. The edges of it trembled. Some echoes tried to break through, unsure of what to do with stillness. But God reached out, steadying them with a smile, and said, "You may rest now. The song will remember you." And the silence deepened. It spread like soft ink through the air, filling the spaces between every note of creation. The waves whispered less, the stars blinked slower, and even time began to learn patience. God watched and listened. It was not empty. It was full of potential, full of breath, full of waiting. He knelt beside the newborn quiet and shaped it with his hands. Silence, he discovered, had texture, smoother than air, yet heavier than wind. He let it pool in valleys and rest beneath trees. He hid it under wings and between the beats of every heart. He draped it over mountains and tucked it beneath rivers. And wherever he placed it, the world softened. The first creatures to notice were the birds. They tilted their heads at the calm air, uncertain. For the first time, they could hear their own wings. Then came the oceans, vast, restless things that now found themselves breathing more slowly. Waves began to pause between crashes, as if thinking. And deep beneath them, whales sang differently, longer, slower, aware now of the silence between their notes. The world was learning to listen. God smiled. "Good," he said softly. "Now, let's see what grows here." And out of silence, new sounds were born, small, tender ones. The drip of water on stone, the crack of a seed splitting open in the dark, the quiet heartbeat of a sleeping creature. These weren't part of the old song. They belonged to the silence. They were its gifts, proof that even what does not speak can create. As the world grew used to quiet, God began to wander among it. He walked through meadows where the grass didn't sing but sighed, through forests where the leaves rustled softly, no longer afraid to be still. Every step he took was careful, reverent. The silence he'd made deserved gentleness. He discovered something beautiful. When there was quiet, Even small things could be heard. The footsteps of ants, the heartbeat of the earth, the whisper of light touching water. Before those things had existed, but they were lost in the thunder of creation's constant song. Now, they finally had a stage. Silence, he realized, was not emptiness. It was room, space for smallness to matter. He sat beside a river and listened to the water think. It flowed slower now, murmuring to itself in little circles, as though remembering every journey it had taken. When the wind brushed the surface, the ripples shimmered and whispered their gratitude. The sound wasn't loud, but it was alive. "Thank you," the river seemed to say. "I can hear myself again." And God smiled. Night came then, the first true night since the world had learned rest. It arrived quietly, not like a curtain drawn, but like a slow exhale after holding one's breath too long. Stars flickered awake, shy and gentle. The moon, curious, peeked over the edge of the horizon, her light silver and cool. Silence bloomed fully under her watch. Every creature that once filled the dark with fear now found comfort in it. Wolves no longer howled to fill the space. They howled to honor it. Owls didn't cry out to break it. They sang to keep it company. Even the crickets, those restless keepers of rhythm, began to play in time with the quiet, their chirps spaced carefully, lovingly, between breaths. It was music born of restraint. God watched the world sleeping, the silence wrapping it like a soft blanket. He realized then that silence was a kind of love, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself. He touched the edge of the moonlight and let it drift across the land like dust. "This," he said, "is the space between all things. It will hold them when they're tired. It will steady them when they forget who they are." And from that moment on, silence became the hidden foundation beneath every heartbeat, every breath, every note of song or word of prayer. Even when sound returned, it carried silence within it, like lungs carrying air. Without it, the world would collapse from exhaustion. But God wasn't finished. He wanted to teach creation how to build silence, not just receive it. So he went to the mountains and carved long valleys where echoes could wander until they grew tired. He shaped caves deep beneath the earth where no sound could reach, places meant for thought and rest. He whispered to the trees, teaching them how to move without noise. He taught snow to fall in perfect quiet so that even chaos could arrive gently. And in the stillness of one long winter night, God did something he'd never done before. He sat down. He closed his eyes. And he said nothing at all. The world waited. A minute passed, or maybe a century. Then, from that sacred pause, came something entirely new. Peace. Not peace as agreement or perfection, but peace as presence. The kind that arrives when nothing is demanded, and everything simply is. The stars brightened a little, sensing it. The ocean settled. The wind brushed over sleeping fields and decided not to speak. And in the heart of all that stillness, something pulsed softly. Not sound, not word, just a heartbeat. The heartbeat of silence itself. God listened. It was the first thing he hadn't made to praise him. It simply existed beside him, equal in beauty. He smiled and whispered, "Welcome." And silence, though it had no voice, answered by staying exactly as it was. The silence God built began to travel. It crept beyond the forests and rivers, slipping between thoughts and breathing itself into every living thing. At first, no one noticed. It moved too softly for attention, like dust falling through sunlight, or the faint vibration before a bell rings. But soon, the world began to feel lighter. Words grew slower, Hearts beat calmer. Even time seemed to walk instead of run. God watched, and he saw that silence was learning to belong. In the towns that never stopped talking, the silence hid in corners, under staircases, between doors left ajar, behind curtains that swayed with evening wind. It listened patiently. People hurried past it, carrying their noise like armor, but whenever one paused, just once, to take a breath, silence slipped inside and settled near the ribs. There it waited, humming the same rhythm as the heart. In the deserts, silence was easier to see. It shimmered like heat, bending the horizon, making distance gentle. Travelers wrapped themselves in it like fabric. It cooled their skin and steadied their steps. Sometimes they thought it was loneliness, but when they stopped walking, they realized it was company, the kind that doesn't ask for anything in return. God walked with them unseen, leaving footprints that disappeared almost as soon as they were made. This, he whispered, is what truth sounds like before it learns to speak. Mountains understood immediately. They had always loved quiet, though they never knew why. Now they did. The silence rested on their peaks like snow that never melted. When storms passed, the mountains held their breath a moment longer than the sky, as if tasting the peace that followed thunder. From their stillness, rivers learned patience. They would carry sound again soon enough, but now, for a heartbeat, they too could listen. In villages by those rivers, silence became prayer. Fishermen cast nets without shouting to one another. They had discovered that fish swam closer when the water wasn't broken by noise. Mothers rocked infants and learned that the space between lullaby notes mattered more than the melody. Blacksmiths paused between hammer strikes to feel the cooling metal breathe. Farmers stood in fields before sunrise, hands at their sides, and let the hush of dew remind them that work begins best from calm. God was pleased. The silence was teaching without words. He sent it higher then, into the sky itself. Clouds carried it the way sails carry wind, drifting over oceans and deserts and plains. Wherever rain fell softly, people said, "The world is thinking." They were right. The world was remembering the stillness it had been built from. When evening came, silence grew stronger. It walked with the shadows, threading through doorways, pooling under lamplight. Musicians found it first. They discovered that a pause could hold more feeling than a note. One night, a young man sat at a broken piano and played only the white keys. Between each tone, he left a gap wide enough for the listener's breath. Those who heard it wept, though they could not say why. God smiled. They are hearing the shape of grace. Writers began to find silence between their words. Painters left parts of their canvas untouched, trusting that emptiness could speak. Even laughter changed. It became deeper, truer, touched by the echo of quiet that came before and after. God visited the seas again. Ships moved over them like small thoughts crossing a sleeping mind. Below, whales carried silence inside their songs. They swam through it, then filled it with voices older than memory. Every note they sang sank miles into the deep and came back softer, as though silence itself had kissed it. On land, snow began to fall. It covered branches, rooftops, and footprints. The air thickened with calm so complete that even sound seemed to bow. The silence of snow was different from night's hush. It was visible. You could watch it descend. It didn't stop life. It framed it. Children laughed quietly beneath it, learning that joy can be gentle. God stood among them invisible, feeling the weightless world. "Silence," he said. is how the heart learns its own language. Then he turned his gaze toward humankind's busier places, the markets, the cities, the roads that never slept. There the silence struggled. It tried to settle between bells and wheels and chatter, but the noise was fierce. So God whispered again, not louder, just nearer. Some heard him. A woman paused while arguing and felt her anger lose its shape. A craftsman stopped his hammer halfway down and saw the beauty in the stillness before impact. A child crying in the street forgot why, because the world suddenly sounded softer. Each time silence found a home like that, it grew stronger. God gathered these small moments as if collecting seeds. He blew them back into the wind, letting them scatter across generations. Some landed in monasteries where monks listened for God inside quiet walls. Others fell into hospitals where nurses held patients' hands instead of speaking. Many drifted into music, rests between notes, the heartbeat under rhythm, the deep breath before the singer begins. By then, silence was everywhere, yet it still felt hidden. That was its nature. It didn't want to be praised. It wanted to be shared. One night, God climbed a hill to listen to his creation listening. It was a soft orchestra, leaves moving, waves turning, people sleeping, fires sighing. Between all those tiny sounds lay the silence he had built, a net of peace holding everything in place. He sat beneath a tree and felt the bark against his back. For a long time, he said nothing. The stars hung above, patient as ever. The moon drifted in and out of clouds, practicing humility. And God realized that silence had become wiser than he expected. It was teaching even him. Because silence, he understood, wasn't simply absence of sound. It was the shape of attention. It was the way love listens before it speaks. It was the pause that lets forgiveness enter. So he gave silence one final blessing. Go where they think they have lost me. Wait there until they remember. The silence bowed and obeyed. It slipped into hospital rooms at midnight, where machines beeped and hearts wavered. In those rooms, when fear rose, silence sat by the bed and steadied the air. It moved into battlefields after the shouting stopped, laying itself over the ground like a gentle hand. It followed mourners to gravesides and stood beside them, saying nothing, because nothing was exactly what they needed. And sometimes, only sometimes, it returned to God to rest. When it did, he would open his hands and let the silence climb back in, small and glowing. They would sit together, the Maker and his quiet creation, watching the world breathe. No words, no need. And in those moments, the universe itself seemed to lean closer, grateful for the stillness that held everything together. God smiled. He had built silence. But the silence in return had built peace. After ages of wandering, the silence God had built was no longer a guest in creation. It had become part of its bones. It lived in every breath, in the soft drift of dust through morning light, in the pause between waves, in the spaces where words dared not go. The world carried silence the way a heart carries rhythm, not always noticed, but always there. The old silence was wiser now. It had learned that every age hears differently. In the beginning, it had been vast and clean, like snow before footsteps. But centuries of sound had shaped it. It now wore the faint perfume of language, of prayer, of footsteps and wind. It wasn't pure emptiness anymore. It was seasoned with memory. God would sometimes walk through time to visit it. He didn't arrive with thunder or the shine of lightning. He came quietly, through a thought left unfinished, through a sigh, through the closing of an eye. The silence always recognized him. It didn't bow, it didn't speak. It simply deepened, as though the world itself was holding its breath for a heartbeat. "They're forgetting you," God said one night as he looked at the world from the edge of a cold mountain. "They think your loneliness now." The silence did not move, but the wind changed direction, brushing against God's robe like understanding. "I know," he whispered, "but they'll learn again. You always return." The silence had always been patient. It had waited through wars, through songs, through the cries of birth and the sighs of death. It had never once demanded attention. It only waited to be remembered. So God began to send it gently back into human lives. He wove it into the smallest, most ordinary things. Because he knew people rarely notice miracles dressed in grandeur, but they often bowed unknowingly before simplicity. He placed silence in the early mornings when the air hung thick and blue before anyone had spoken. He let it rest between two lovers lying awake, their fingers touching, saying nothing. He hid it inside the heartbeat of a newborn asleep against a mother's chest. And in the hush that follows laughter when the room grows full, but no one wants to break the calm. Everywhere he placed it, silence did what it always did. It steadied the world. As time passed, monks learned to seek it. In monasteries built on cliffs and deserts, they gathered not to speak to God, but to hear him. They built stone walls thick enough to keep out the wind, and within those walls, silence became almost tangible, a presence that pressed gently against skin. When they prayed, their words were slow, spaced like stepping stones across a still pond. When they finished, they let the quiet fill the space where words had been, because they knew that what came after prayer was as sacred as the prayer itself. God watched and smiled. "They are speaking my native tongue," he said. But not all silence lived in holy places. In cities where voices rose and wheels screamed and lights drowned the stars, silence learned to move differently. It became clever, a shadow between sounds, a heartbeat between alarms, a breath between sentences. It didn't fight the noise, it danced with it, slipping through the gaps like water through fingers. It found the tired, the lonely, the seekers, and rested on their shoulders unnoticed. There was a woman who worked in a hospital, moving from bed to bed through long fluorescent nights. Machines hummed and shoes squeaked. But sometimes when she held a hand, all the noise fell away. Patients always said the same thing after she left. It felt peaceful when she was here. They never knew it was the silence moving through her touch. Another lived in a city apartment above a busy street. Every night, he turned off the television and sat by the window. He didn't know why he did it. He just watched the world and breathed. Over time, the silence filled his small room like a tide, climbing the walls, touching his chest, washing away the day's dust. In that quiet, he began to remember old kindnesses, long-forgotten faces, and moments he had hurried through. The silence didn't scold him. It simply gave him time to feel. Children found it too, though they didn't know its name. They would lie awake listening to the hum of the house, counting their breaths, letting the darkness speak. In those moments, the silence was their teacher. It taught them how to listen without fear. Artists, poets, and musicians carried it differently. They began to realize that silence wasn't something to escape. It was part of their art. A painter left half a canvas blank, saying, "The emptiness is where the light lives." A musician held a note too long and discovered that the pause afterward felt like breathing again. A writer stopped mid-sentence and realized that the story continued in the mind of whoever read it. The silence had become a collaborator, not an absence. God loved watching this. He had not commanded it. The world was simply remembering on its own. You see, he told the silence, they are rebuilding you with their hands. But silence was not prideful. It stayed low, hidden. It had no need to be worshipped. Its holiness was humility itself, the kind that never asks to be noticed, only to be allowed. In certain hours, God would walk through the still places, forests after snow, empty chapels, rooms after love had left. There, he would find the silence in its purest form. It didn't bow to him. It didn't need to. It simply held him, like a mother holding a child too old to be carried, but still small enough to be comforted. You've done well, he'd whisper, and the silence would hum faintly, a vibration beneath everything. As the centuries unfolded, people began to write about silence. Some feared it, some chased it, some mistook it for death, but others, wiser, began to say things like, "In silence, I find myself again," or, "When the world is quiet, I hear what never left." Those were the moments God cherished most, not when humanity praised him loudly, but when it sat still long enough to feel his nearness. And yet, the world was changing again. New machines filled the air with constant hums. Music played without pause. People wore sound around them like armor. Silence became rare, but it never vanished. It simply retreated deeper, finding refuge in smaller, quieter hearts. It went where love went unnoticed. It stayed where kindness was done in secret. It lived in the sigh after forgiveness, in the pause before someone says, "I'm sorry," in the long breath after someone says, "I love you." Even in the digital noise of the new age, silence learned new ways to survive. It slipped through headphones when music stopped. It rested in the space before a message was answered. It lingered between heartbeats during a pause in conversation. And though few recognized it anymore, silence had never been stronger. For wherever there was a single soul willing to stop, breathe, and listen, it was home. God saw this and was content. "It's enough," he said quietly. "They'll find me there." Then he closed his eyes, and for the first time in 1,000 years, he rested, not in heaven, but in the silence of his own creation. When silence had learned to live among humankind, it wished not merely to endure, but to be understood. And God, who had watched it drift like a tender tide beneath centuries of clamour, knew the time had come for silence and sound, to weave a truer friendship than distant coexistence. He called them, sound arriving first in colour and story, laughter and thunder and pulse, silence following in the soft garment of presence, and set them face to face inside the hidden chamber of the world's breath. Sound said, "You erase me," and silence answered, "I give you shape." The winds paused at the doorway, the oceans curved their backs into stillness, and mountains held their breath like dignified elders. In the attentive hush that followed, sound heard its own edges for the first time and discovered the gentleness of ending. God smiled, because that was the seed of harmony. From then on, the two began to practice kindness together. Sound, learning to bend and bow. Silence, learning to cradle and return. Music loosened its grip on mastery and learned humility in rests. Words found weight because quiet carried them. Footsteps became prayer when they remembered to pause. And the heartbeat, oldest drum of the body, was crowned sacred, not for its thud, but for the mercy space between beats. Cities still buzzed like hives, and deserts still rang with heat, yet under stone and under sky, a subtler river flowed. Silence, patient as a mother's hand on a fevered brow, escorting every note, cough, whisper, bell, engine, and oath toward meaning without ever demanding credit. The change began so small that only children felt it first. Little ones lying awake with eyes wide open, counting breaths in a dark room, and realizing that the dark was not a mouth to swallow them, but a wing to cover them. Lovers noticed it next when they ran out of words and did not fall, and artisans when their fingers hovered above clay or keys and found, in the hovering, the exact courage the next touch required. A violinist lengthened a single inhale before lowering the bow. The hall leaned forward with her and learned that suspense is benign when love holds the line. A mason stood on scaffolding at dusk and understood that a wall needs windows the way a phrase needs air. A baker, up long before dawn, paused with flour on his forearms and listened to the old oven creak, and in that listening felt his father's hands again. These were not miracles that bruised the sky. They were ordinary mercies in the grammar of breath. Sound grew less afraid of being interrupted. Silence grew less afraid of being blamed. They met in thresholds, under lintels where shoes are removed, at bedsides where whispers lean close, on piers where late boats unfold their lanterns like patient stars. They practiced their partnership in storms and weddings and courtrooms and kitchens. Thunder flashing, then stepping back so rain could speak. Vows rising, and then resting so tears could tell the truth. Verdicts delivered and allowed to land inside the hush that safeguards dignity. Quarrels doused not by concession, but by the slowed breathing that invites repair. Even machines, faithful idols of a noisy age, began to serve the pact. Escalators humming softer at night. Traffic lights waiting an extra blink before changing. Hospital monitors shrouding their cries beneath a nurse's palm for one quiet moment, so a goodbye could pass unshaken. God walked through this new etiquette of the world and called it the craft of listening. He found choirs finishing a hymn and standing still long enough to let the echo become the final note. He found bookstores at closing, with lamps dimming inch by inch so that pages did not feel abandoned. He found libraries breathing, real lungs of a city. He wandered mountain trails where hikers stopped for no reason except that the pines had asked them to, and wetlands at dusk where herons stitched the horizon with slow thread and frogs tuned one by one like distant clocks. Everywhere the partnership held, a third thing appeared. Something neither purely sound nor purely silence, as if the marriage itself had a child named Peace. Peace did not arrive like a treaty. It arrived like dew, beading every surface with a coolness that made even grief easier to touch. Morning learned new manners in its presence. Families sitting together saying nothing, letting chairs do the holding. Elders teaching young hands to fold a flag with pauses that honoured breath as much as banner. Friends placing coffee on a table and then keeping watch over a hurt the way lighthouse beams keep time with the sea. Not all welcomed the change. There were corners of the world that worshipped acceleration the way deserts worship mirage. And there, voices stacked upon voices until meaning thinned like air at altitude. Yet even in those towers of echo, silence survived like a fern in a city crack, tiny, green, invincible, waiting for the shoe that would not fall. It entered through fatigue, through awe, through the soft sabotage of beauty, the way snow edits a street into punctuation marks, the way dawn writes a balcony in pale cursive across a room, the way a child asleep in a car turns the highway into a lullaby. When the door opened, silence did not scold. It set a chair at the table and nodded to sound to continue, slower, kinder, and sound, relieved, confessed that it had never wanted to shout. It had simply been afraid no one would hear. Silence promised to stay close enough that whispering could be brave again. Together they visited fields where threshers rested, chapels between services smelling of wax and warmed pews, studios where brushes paused mid-air, green rooms where comedians closed their eyes and let the last laugh leave the stage without being chased. They stood by teachers counting to 3 before answering a question, by surgeons standing still for one steadying heartbeat before the first incision, by judges letting a sentence land not as a hammer, but as a bell. They sat with prisoners learning that repentance begins in pauses, and with newborn parents stunned silent by the first inhale their child stole from the world. They travelled rivers, low, slow, brown water, carrying voices under bridges where graffiti whispered better poems than speeches. They crossed deserts that sounded like hot glass and carried the mirage smell of distance. They rose into mountains where ravens wrote black calligraphy across a page of sky, and their croaks landed one by one like period marks in an essay old as stone. They swept into cities at 3 a.m., the hour when neon admits it is tired, when dishwashers lull buildings, when the moon practices kindness on rooftops. And wherever they went, the same lesson unfolded. That truth prefers a porch to a podium, a hand to a handle, a room with a door half open so voices can enter and leave without scraping the frame. Something else changed then. Memory itself learned to breathe. Stories stopped sprinting and began to arrive with the cadence of rocking chairs. Apologies washed cleaner because they were rinsed in quiet. Forgiveness, that shy animal, ventured out of the tree line. Even justice adjusted its gait. Less gallop, more gravitas, less clamour, more clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when the glare is lowered and the lamp is shaded and papers are read slowly enough for meaning to rise from ink like steam. Sound and silence tutored craft together. Carpenters taught apprentices the pause before the strike. Potters taught pupils the stillness that lets walls remember vertical. Coders learned to stare at white space long enough to see the bug that brags in noise. And athletes learned that the held breath before a serve contains the point already won. In gardens, bees spun syllables around blossoms, while dragonflies wrote commas above ponds. In barns, cows answered the dawn with long vowels, and the barn returned them as gentle consonants. In kitchens, knives made patient rain on boards. In bedrooms, curtains rehearsed their nocturnes. The more the world practiced this shared choreography, the more merciful sound became. Sirens learned to kneel at corners. Announcements learned to end. Opinion learned to wash its hands before touching a wound. Even celebration shed its need to be loud and grew interested in being true. Weddings with vows that fit in the space of a single breath. Graduations where the loudest moment was a parent's silent pride. Victories marked with hands resting on teammates' backs. Nothing shouted, everything said. Then, because creation always tests what it loves, storms came, loud ones, ridiculous with lightning, and sound leaped like a colt, stomping puddles across the fields of attention. Silence did not flee. It stood next to the rain and waited for the thunder to spend itself, and when the last rumble became a purr, it laid a shawl across the land and said, "There, now listen to the dripping." Children opened windows and learned that the world has 1,000 ways to be quiet without being still. God watched the lesson take root and walked to a harbour where fog made bells talk to distance. He watched a captain wait 3 counts between horn calls so the echo could bring a reply from the unseen, and he thought, This is prayer in maritime. He walked to a hospice where a nurse oiled door hinges so farewells could pass without a squeak, and he thought, this is theology in practice. He stood in a rehearsal room where a conductor lowered his baton not to command but to bless the rest, and he thought, this is the sanctuary under the stave. And at last he returned to the place inside the first breath where nothing had been, and he asked sound and silence to meet him there. Tell me, he said, not because he lacked knowledge, but because love enjoys hearing what it already knows. Sound said it had discovered courage in being soft and dignity in ending. Silence said it had discovered joy in making room for other voices. God said, then go teach them together. And the two set out like travelling companions who understood the route at last. One carrying stories, one carrying space, both carrying mercy. Their road led into bedrooms where insomnia had built ladders of worry. They took the ladders down, rung by rung, until the floor touched feet again. It led into parliaments where microphones had forgotten their job. They returned the job, to lift truth rather than volume. It led into sanctuaries where even prayer talked too much. They reintroduced awe, which is the sound of silence wearing light. It led into headphones where songs learned to breathe, into podcasts that left room for nodding, into videos that knew when to show a window and let the viewer hear birds. And because the world is round and loves to rhyme, their road curved back to kitchens at dawn, to stoops at dusk, to field paths at noon, simple places where the pact felt natural. There, a strange abundance began. Families found that a shared meal needed fewer words when gratitude held the chairs. Neighbours discovered that a shared fence could be a long pause full of kindness. Strangers on a bus learned that silence can sit between them without suspicion if both are willing to look out the window and recognise the same sky. Little by little, the anxious hinge in the day eased. Clocks still moved, but stopped shouting. Calendars kept their squares, but grew less smug. To-do lists learned the sacrament of crossing out tasks that did not belong. The evening news, trying something brave, aired one unnarrated minute of the ocean and was shocked to learn that markets did not collapse. Lawyers left space in contracts for grace. Doctors left space in prognoses for wonder. Coders left space in interfaces for breath. Teachers left space in syllabi for drift. Parents left space in bedtime for the grand old silence to sit on the mattress and stroke the air until thoughts lay down. By then, sound and silence had become such companions that each could speak the other's language. Sound learned to say, I'm sorry, the way silence says, I'm here. Silence learned to laugh the way sound laughs when no one is being watched. And together, they invented a new blessing for the world. Not a word and not a hush, but a woven thing like shade under a tree. A place where travellers can stop, refill, and hear themselves belong. God listened to this interwoven life and understood that creation had learned his oldest craft, the making of room. For room is what he made in the beginning. Room is what he keeps making in hearts that allow it. Room is what sound and silence now preserve for each other, so that nothing true has to shout and nothing holy has to hide. And so the world carried on, trains humming, gulls crying, ovens ticking, leaves performing their quiet choreography, with a deeper rhythm underneath, the pulse of voices that know when to rest, of instruments that trust the pause, of feet that do not hurry past beauty. If ever the pact wavered, night returned to tutor day, setting a soft hand on its shoulder and reminding it that even light sleeps to stay kind. And when morning rose, it did not conquer, it conversed. In that conversation, humanity finally heard what God had been saying since the first hush. That love's clearest sound is the small space it leaves for another to breathe, and that a world trained in that music will never be loud enough to drown its own heart, nor quiet enough to forget it. When the covenant between sound and silence had settled into the world like a tide that finally knew the moon's name, silence began its next labour, to root itself inside people until it spoke through them the way sap speaks through wood, unseen and undeniable. God watched the quiet move inward, past lips and lungs, past ribs and memory, until it reached the deep well where the self lowers its bucket each morning for courage. There, silence built a stair. It did not demand descent. It simply offered a way, and those who found it began to carry silence outward the way lanterns carry fire, not to burn, but to reveal. The first to sense the stair were keepers of the late hours, nurses, guards, repairers, writers, bakers, the small priesthood of those who stay awake so others may sleep. They had long known the night's manners. Now they learned the inner hush that steadies hands and widens vision. A nurse felt the ward's alarms turn from shouting to signals, each beep a syllable inside a larger sentence whose grammar was mercy. A guard standing under a sodium lamp recognized that watching is not suspicion, but love in uniform. A writer discovered that the blank page was not an enemy, but a meadow, and the wind that moved through it was the mind remembering how to listen. A baker, elbow deep in flour, began to knead as if he were folding rest into the dough so families could eat patience in the morning. Across the world, silence apprenticed people into gentler crafts. A violin maker holding his breath while tapping a plate of maple, listening for the shy note where the wood says yes. A midwife pausing between instructions so a labouring woman could hear her own wild wisdom rise. A mediator letting a room cool before allowing words to try again. A carpenter standing by a window frame and sensing through fingertips that the house desired one deep, unhurried inhale before receiving glass. God wandered through these human studios and recognized his old work return to him transformed, the way rivers give back clouds. He knew then that silence had grown a voice, not an audible one, but a habit that spoke in touch, timing, and restraint. The habit reached choirs that once sang as if volume were virtue and taught them to lean back from crescendos so the echo could complete the thought. It visited judges who discovered that the truest part of a verdict is the pause after it is read, when the court learns whether it will be cruel or kind. It visited marketplaces where bargaining had been a contest and turned it into a choreography in which both sides listened for the price that allowed morning to respect evening. It visited kitchens hot with steam and urgency and convinced a chef to cut the flame for 3 heartbeats so the sauce could remember itself. And it visited bedrooms where partners carried luggage from old storms and taught them to place it down together, hands open, while the room filled with a quiet so soft it could be mistaken for nothing until one of them dared to cry. In schools, silence changed the architecture of learning. It became the white space around a problem, the intermission in a lecture, the wide margin where a young person's questions could survive until they had language. Teachers stopped racing the clock and began trusting the bell to ring when understanding arrived. Students discovered that confusion is not failure, but a room where silence tutors impatience. Libraries, those reservoirs of human breath bound in spines, learned to hum lower, and even their clocks ticked as if they were breathing on behalf of the shy. Silence walked into the arts and asked for custody of endings. Dancers let a final gesture hang, hands open to air like nets lifted from a silver river. Actors left a stage before applause could catch them, trusting absence to finish the line. Painters surrendered the last brushstroke to the canvas itself and learned that unfinished is another spelling of alive. Musicians grew courageous enough to play fewer notes with fuller hearts. They learned that a rest can be a door and that an audience can be trusted to walk through. And audiences changed. They began to listen with their chests, not only their ears. They let tears move without apology. They accepted that beauty is often the sound a room makes after the bow leaves the string. Silence moved deeper still, into places where repair was overdue. It entered councils where tempers had taught everyone to shout in order to be believed, and taught them the astonishment of being heard without raising a voice. It entered the long corridors of grief and showed mourners how to keep company with sorrow without turning it into spectacle. It entered wards where machines declared outcomes in numbers and taught families to sit with breath, to recognize that a hand can still speak after a mouth falls quiet. It entered prisons where hope wore thin and taught the stubborn gospel that a minute of true stillness can widen a cell until sky fits inside. It entered phone calls between estranged friends and, without ceremony, held the line while pride exhausted itself. God stood beside these small reconciliations and smiled the way dawn smiles when a window is opened for it. He remembered the first hush he spoke and recognized it beating inside ordinary courage. The world did not stop being noisy. Buses still hissed, stadiums still roared, branches still cracked in winter winds. But the noise ceased to be a tyrant. It became landscape, and in that landscape, silence built hermitages that did not require exile. A pair of headphones removed and placed deliberately on a desk. A walk without a destination. A sink full of dishes done with sleeves rolled and phone face down. The electricity of a crowded platform softened by two people exchanging a nod that meant, "We both belong." In workshops, silence taught craft to slow time. A luthier sanded with strokes aligned to grain so wood would forgive the blade. A coder watched a blinking cursor until anxiety released and the bug confessed its hiding place. A translator waited for the word that obeyed two languages at once. A surgeon pressed fingers to a wrist not for data but for story, and felt a patient's life tell itself in tempo. Silence made adults gentler with children, and children braver with questions. Bedtime became less about finishing the day, and more about receiving the night. Lamps dimmed earlier. Voices dropped a register. Hallways remembered how to cradle footsteps. And houses rediscovered their vocation as instruments tuned to the key of home. Silence taught parents to let a child's fear sit on the bed like an invited guest. It taught children that the monster in the closet is sometimes only the closet needing light. It taught both that holding hands accomplishes more than explaining. In faith houses, silence matured prayer. Words did not vanish, they ripened. Liturgies widened their ribs to let breath enter. Preachers learned that a sermon is not complete until the congregation has time to answer privately. Chanting communities calibrated their tones to the hum of the room, trusting architecture and the resting bodies within it to compose with them. And those who doubted learned that silence is a chapel no absence can close. In laboratories, silence reformed curiosity. The frantic rush for results gave ground to watching. Microscopists sat still long enough to see cells converse. Astronomers turned off jubilant announcement and listened to dark matter insist on being called mystery. Field biologists understood that patience is the camouflage by which truth allows approach. Silence taught data the art of humility. How to speak quietly enough that wonder could add its footnote. In governments, it made brave people slower. Orators began to leave space that no slogan could occupy. Negotiators risked pause and let dignity find the seat. Clerks proofread laws as if reading wedding vows, because after signatures, lives would be married to them. Silence guarded the threshold where words become world. In commerce, it made transactions human again. A barista, before the morning rush, held a cup under a stream not to fill it, but to hear the pitch change as temperature rose. A cashier, seeing hurry in someone's eyes, set down the scanner and gave them back a moment that had been stolen earlier. A craft seller wrapped a handmade thing as if the paper were a lullaby. Silence made business remember that the root of worth is not noise, but care. In sport, it taught power to move like water. A sprinter steadied at the blocks until the body's drum aligned with the starter's pistol. A climber paused mid-route, leaning into stone to hear where the next hold wanted to be. A goalkeeper, knees bent, let the stadium's thunder roll past until the shooter's breathing wrote the direction of the kick. Even defeat changed tone. Locker rooms filled with the hush that knows this is not the end, but the soil in which skill grows. Silence belonged also to streets where injustice had rehearsed for years. It taught marchers that chanting needs rests too, so truth can catch breath and elders can be heard. It taught cameras to hold a face long enough that a person became a person again. It taught officials that listening is not weakness, but the only machinery sturdy enough to carry change. And when nights ended and days returned, silence walked beside fatigue like a friend with gentle pockets, offering minutes the way others offer mints. God, searching for human places where his old craft had become native, found them in the least glamorous corners. Laundromats at midnight, custodial closets that smelled of lemon and patience, buses where drivers greeted each rider with the same quiet respect, museum benches occupied by one small life, looking at one great painting long enough for both to speak without sound. He found them in kitchens where someone rinsed the sink before leaving, because leaving a place calmer than one found, it is a dialect of prayer. In bedrooms where lovers turned off the lamp not to end the day, but to let tenderness speak its first fluent language. In classrooms where the shy answered by drawing on the silence with a pencil nobody had noticed was sharp. He found silence governing the delicate mechanics of apology, the choosing of a doorbell's hour, the head tilted to receive what one would rather refuse, the hands held still instead of turning into flags, the gracious stepping aside to let the wounded pass first into relief. He found silence reconciling generations, grandparents accepting that their stories land best when they arrive on the slow train, grandchildren learning that questions asked softly travel farther. He found it rewilding attention in little parks between glass towers where bees threaded traffic with a hum older than currency. Now that silence spoke through people, it began to teach something bolder: how to bless with restraint. Therapists learned to ask fewer questions, to trust eyes to finish paragraphs, to keep their hands as quiet as the room. Journalists learned to let answers stand without the scaffolding of commentary. Designers learned to remove one more ornament than pride allowed. Chefs learned to stop before triumph. Leaders learned to leave a meeting with one sentence unsaid, so their teams had room to become authors. Parents learned to wait on thresholds, while adolescents rearranged their inner furniture. Friends learned that not texting back immediately can sometimes be fidelity to presence. And lovers learned the liturgy of the forehead, kissed in silence. Sound did not retreat during this renaissance. It ripened. it discovered that gentleness is not the absence of power, but its direction. Language found that vowels can carry compassion across distance if consonants do not trample them. Laughter, freed from performance, began to sound like water over stones. Song, unafraid, wandered into minor keys and told the truth without flinching because it trusted the listener's silence to hold sorrow without trying to fix it. In this age, failure gained new dignity. The quiet after collapse was no longer a void to be filled with explanations. It became a greenhouse where humility sprouted. Teams replayed their mistakes in rooms tuned to the frequency of learning. Families sat with bankruptcy papers until shame exhausted itself and realism could breathe. Artists showed drafts, scarred and honest, and young makers felt relief flood their bones. Excellence, they learned, has always been the child of listening. When winter came, silence wrote its gospel in frost. Streetlights wore halos, sidewalks learned italic, roofs practiced the art of bearing. In the morning, boots translated calm into a vocabulary of prints, dog paws as ellipses, child steps as exclamation points, careful elders as long dashes. Coffee steamed like prayer. Radiators composed hymns in C minor. Even radiance was quiet. Spring arrived like a footnote-made meadow. Parentheses of birdsong around arguments of rain. Seeds opening their small doors and asking nothing except time. Summer spoke in low vowels over lakes. Autumn did not explain itself. It simply set fire to edges and asked the wind to carry the sermon. Through every season, silence kept house in the heart. There, it became both threshold and hearth, both porch and pillow, both page and glue. People returned to it daily, not with schedules, but with instinct, the way hands find pockets in cold. They discovered that inside the day there is a hidden room where decisions ripen and harshness loses weight. They learned the craft of stepping into that room before sending, posting, buying, judging, replying. In that room, cruelty looked like noise and kindness like tone. The more they visited, the less the outside rattled them. Their words shortened, their glances lengthened, their schedules sprouted margins, their touch grew accurate. They did not become saints, they became proportionate. The world, measuring them, relaxed, and God, hearing this interior music widen, sat with silence on the lip of evening and asked, as he had asked at the start, what next? Silence, which had never spoken aloud and did not begin now, offered presence. Together they watched a train howl across a valley, and then not, watched a mother lower a mobile phone and lift her child, watched a drummer lay down sticks and listen to the room throb with what had already been played, watched an old man on a park bench guard the last 10 minutes of daylight as if they were treasure he would leave to strangers. Next, God said at last, is nothing novel. Only more people remembering this is the oldest language. And so, the invitation widened, not by decree, but by example. One person at a time learned to build silence the way birds build nests, with what is at hand, with what wind brings, with patience for a shape that holds. They tucked it into mornings before headlines, into commutes between stations, into waiting rooms where names were called, into hallways outside doors they were afraid to knock upon. They wore it into meetings like an unbranded garment. They set it on tables between bowls and bread. And when night returned to brief the day, silence reported that the mission was proceeding by ordinary miracles. Sound nodded in agreement, proud to be kinder. The world did not become perfect. It became hearable. And in the hearable world, God's first word, the hush that made room for every other word, could move again like a river under stone, like breath under song, like love under everything. When the world had learned to live with silence inside it, God watched to see what humanity would do next. He saw that quiet had become not a visitor, but a resident, a steady tenant in the house of time. Yet silence, like all living things, still wished to grow. It longed not only to dwell within people, but to speak through them, to be shared, to be built upon, to be given as gift and medicine. And so began the next turning, the age when silence would learn to move through language, and when language would finally learn to serve silence. It started in small ways, as all holy things do. A woman walked to the sea each morning and watched the tide erase her footprints, understanding, without needing to say it, that her worries were doing the same. A teacher, tired from endless explanations, began to pause halfway through sentences and found that her students finished the thought more clearly than she could. A painter dipped his brush, stopped, waited for the air to settle, and realized that stillness was the best color on his palette. A boy, raised in a house where arguments were loud, learned to hold his tongue and discovered that sometimes mercy sounds like restraint. One night, in a desert monastery, silence itself began to hum. The monks heard it not with ears but through skin, a low vibration like the heartbeat of the world, reminding them they were inside something vast and kind. They called it the breath beneath the breath. From then on, when they prayed, they did not beg or perform. They breathed and listened. The sound of that breathing drifted down the mountain into villages, through open windows and sleeping streets, and the villagers found their own rhythms softening to match. Even those who didn't believe felt calmer without knowing why. God smiled, for silence had learned evangelism without speech. In cities, the same truth arrived differently. Musicians began writing songs that ended before the listener expected, leaving a beautiful ache behind. Architects designed courtyards that made echoes sing before fading. Writers began using fewer words, and readers felt as though the spaces between lines glowed. Even advertisements, accidentally wise, began to use quiet moments to be noticed. Humanity was learning what God had always known, that attention itself is prayer, and silence is its cathedral. But as silence grew stronger, the world began to change again. A new kind of sound rose, one made not of noise, but of clarity. Conversations deepened. People began to listen past the surface of words to the feeling beneath. Arguments lost their sharp edges. Where once they tried to win, now they tried to understand. News anchors paused to let grief breathe. Lovers learned to leave sentences unfinished so tenderness could finish them instead. Forgiveness became a form of music with rests as important as notes. Even machines joined the lesson. Elevators sighed more quietly, cars hummed softer, doors slowed their closing. Silence was becoming the teacher of movement itself. Yet not everyone welcomed it. There were those who thrived on volume, whose hearts had forgotten how to beat without applause. They feared quiet because it reflected too much truth. When they shouted, silence did not argue, it simply waited. When they mocked, silence did not hide, it stood behind them like a mountain. Eventually, even the loudest souls grew tired of their own echo, and in the pause that followed, peace slipped in. The world was healing by exhaustion. God, walking unseen among people, began to hear silence in their daily rituals, in the space after thank you, in the glance shared before parting, in the steady breathing of a crowd watching rain. He realized that his first creation had at last become self-sustaining. No longer dependent on his touch, silence now lived inside choice itself. He could rest again. One evening, he wandered through a garden that had been left untended. Vines had overtaken benches, petals lay folded, but bees still moved as though memory itself fed them. The air was thick with late summer scent. He sat beneath a fig tree, closed his eyes, and felt the silence gather around him like a cloak. Then he heard it, the voice of the world, low and blended, the rustle of grass, the sigh of leaves, the heartbeat of soil. It was silence speaking through sound, sound speaking through silence. For the first time, creation had learned to pray without words, and as he listened, he knew that humanity had discovered the final purpose of quiet, not absence, not rest, but reverence. Silence had become the shape of awe. In distant mountains, hermits woke to the same understanding. They stopped seeking visions and began sweeping floors instead, finding holiness in the whisper of the broom. Pilgrims learned to walk without chanting, trusting footsteps as liturgy. Poets wrote entire books that ended in a single blank page. Painters began to sign their names smaller, until one day they stopped signing at all. In every craft, humility returned. God found this beautiful, not because it praised him, but because it freed them. He had never wanted slaves of worship. He wanted partners of wonder. Silence had taught them how. As the years turned, silence began to weave itself into time's fabric. Morning had a different texture, softer, slower. People noticed more. Birds no longer competed with engines. Windows stayed open longer to hear wind. Even grief became sacred, because in the long pauses between sobs, life whispered its promise to continue. In hospitals, silence stood beside the dying and turned fear into gratitude. In prisons, it became a blanket for those who had forgotten their worth. In places of war, it crouched in the rubble and held the names of the lost until someone dared to rebuild. Silence, once fragile, had become eternal. God returned to the edge of the universe, where creation thins into mystery, and looked back at everything he had made. What he saw was music, vast, shimmering, endless. Sound and silence no longer fought for dominance. They danced. One gave, the other received. One shone, the other held. Together they created rhythm, meaning, and mercy. The stars pulsed in time. The oceans breathed. The cities slept. Humanity had learned the oldest lesson in existence, that love is not noise or stillness, but the tender rhythm between the two. God closed his eyes and smiled. The silence did not end. It never would. It had become the heartbeat of everything, the softest word in the divine vocabulary, the quiet after "let there be." When the world had learned to speak in silence and to listen through sound, there came a long and tender stillness, a breath held by creation itself, not out of fear, but out of wonder. God walked once more among the stars and seas and found them resting in the rhythm he had always hoped for. Every tide, every gust of wind, every flutter of leaf or wing seemed to understand that nothing existed alone. Silence had finished its grand work. Yet endings were never truly endings for God. They were doorways, and beyond this doorway waited a mystery even the heavens leaned toward. He wandered through the night, quiet as thought, and looked upon the sleeping earth. Cities glowed faintly, not with noise, but with presence. People dreamed soft, unhurried dreams. Mountains breathed. Rivers murmured in their sleep. Somewhere, an old woman sat awake beside a candle, knitting in peace. A child stirred in his bed and turned toward warmth. A lone musician tuned her instrument, though she would play for no one. All of them moved within the same vast heartbeat. each unaware that their small, still acts were threads in the same invisible fabric. God felt no need to speak. He simply watched, and the watching itself became creation again. For what is creation but the desire to see what love might become if given time? The silence stretched, not as absence but as space, room enough for every voice to be itself. And into that space, new things began to form. Not thunderous births, not bright explosions, but subtle beginnings, the courage to forgive, the decision to stay, the breath drawn before trying once more. These were the quiet miracles, too soft for scripture, too frequent for legend, yet every bit divine. God smiled and thought, "They have learned my secret." It was never to command, never to conquer, never to finish, but to begin again without fear of the pause. The stars brightened as if agreeing. The earth turned beneath his feet, its oceans whispering gratitude. In that moment, time itself bowed, not to end, but to rest. God lifted his gaze toward horizons, yet unseen. There were worlds still forming beyond reach, hearts still waiting for silence to find them, lives not yet dreamed into being. The story was not over. It never would be. It had only found its perfect rhythm, a universe breathing in and out, light and shadow, sound and hush, life and rest. God stepped forward into the unknown, carrying with him the silence he had built, the soft, eternal promise that every ending is only the start of listening again.